Hello, and welcome to the San Bernardino Riverside chapter of the California Native Plant Society. Thank you for joining us for tracking climate change in Joshua Tree National Park. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to welcome those of you who are new to the California Native Plant Society and tell us a little bit about our organization. California native plants are special, from the Joshua tree to the poppy fields to the redwoods. We live in one of the most botanically rich places on earth, with more types of native plants than any other state in the US. CNPS is a nonprofit organization made up of more than 10,000 members, 35 local chapters, and a team of staff. Together, we're working to conserve wildlands, protect endangered species, collect scientific data, and restore nature to our home and public landscapes, one garden at a time. None of us, not the insects, the birds, nor humans, can exist without plants. Save plants, we save everything else. And saving plants saves habitat too. You're inspired by what you see and hear today. Consider becoming involved. You can become a member by visiting cnps.org/join, or sign up to receive our emails and learn more about what we're doing at cnps.org/get-connected. I would like you to meet our team today. Katie Barrows is both our tech host and our questions host, and she's going to tell you how to make your questions. You're on mute.
Good morning, everybody. We would like to ask if you could hold your questions to the end of Dr. Sweet's presentation, and you can type your questions into the Q&A on your screen. We'd prefer you use the Q&A as opposed to the chat, and I'll just be monitoring those questions, and when Dr. Sweet finishes her talk, we'll go through the questions. So thanks very much for joining us.
So thank you, Katie. And now I would like to introduce Dr. Lynn Sweet. Dr. Lynn Sweet is at the University of California, Riverside Center for Conservation Biology. She has a PhD in plant biology from UCR, and she has worked on tree seedling establishment, but at this point in her career, she's focusing on the distribution of desert vegetation and long-term changes in communities of plants due to drought and climate change, which she's going to tell you about right now. Welcome, Dr. Sweet.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me okay? Good?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thanks for joining us this morning. Glad you're here to join me to talk a little bit about desert species and climate change in Joshua Tree National Park. Thank you for the introduction, Orchid. I'm a plant ecologist. I look at biogeography and conservation biology out here at the UC Riverside Palm Desert campus. All right, and I'll just go through the slides. Advance, there we go. Okay, so we're going to talk a lot about climate change impacts today, so I wanted to give you a little bit of background. We've worked with principal climate change scientist for the National Park Service, Dr. Patrick Gonzalez, to design some of our studies. He's done a lot of research on climate change, including a summary report of climate change impacts on the national parks. So from his research, the arid, Southwest has experienced the sharpest decline in precip, the lowest, the contiguous 48 states. We've already seen increases in the levels of aridity and hotter temperatures that have been seen for quite some time. So these are troubling. And how do we know that? How do we know that we might be possibly responsible for this as humans? We can attribute it to human activity because we have the highest CO2 level in 800,000 years. This additional CO2 in the atmosphere isotopically matches fossil fuels, and it's not attributable to natural sources of the additional CO2. And those higher CO2s cause higher temperatures. That's shown in physics. And if you look at all of the causes of temperature increase, rise, less than 3% could be explained by any other factor than anthropogenic means. So this is what we're dealing with. This is what we have to, when we do our research, this is the landscape we're dealing with. So I also wanted to acknowledge where we're doing our research. So we we do our research out in Joshua Tree National Park, and we want to acknowledge that land on which we conduct this research is the ancestral home of people, the traditional territory of the Serrano, Chemehuevi, Kuya, and Mojave tribes. And those people continue to have a relationship with the land. And it's vital that we recognize those beginnings and think about this, how we can think about that culture with respect, also respect to the land. So I'm going to start with a little bit about climate in Joshua Tree National Park, so we can start thinking about this land in the context of what's going on with climate change. So this is a picture I took looking west from Park Boulevard near Cottonwood. So if we look at temperature in Joshua Tree National Park, this is a lot to look at. So this is a map showing maximum summer temperature from 1951 to 1980, and kind of ignore the jagged blue line here. That was our modeling domain. This is the outline of Joshua Tree National Park here. I think you can see my mouse. This is Yucca Valley up here, Joshua Tree. And the temperatures here, you don't have to worry about the colors, what they mean exactly, but red is hot and blue is cold. So this is looking at a gridded surface of raster data for maximum temperature during the historic period before now, 1951 to 1980, as produced by climatologists. Then we look at that surface, what happens moving towards now. So 1981 to 2010, this is what we look like. So we're seeing some of those temperatures, especially from the Coachella Valley, start to creep up into Joshua Tree. And then what we do as biogeographers is we wonder what's going to happen in the future with climate. And so we take this data from climatologists to use with our mapping and modeling. So some of the data we use looks like this. So this is a future we could see. And so you can see some of those bands of temperature moving upward in elevation and northward. This is 2070 to 2099. This is the modeled maximum summer temperature. And so this is an average over the month. But what you can think about when thinking about species and how this might affect them, you might, if you see increases in temperature, you might see species migrating to keep up with that band in color that we've seen shift here. And I'll just page back so you could watch that happen again. So imagine one of the color bands, and then you could watch that shift. So we could see reductions in abundance of species. We could see mortality in species, or we can see them migrate. And we'll talk a little bit more about climate change sensitivity. This is a regionalized a climatology for Joshua Tree that was just came out. It was a fellow out of Arizona State that used the meteorology stations throughout the park that were set up in conjunction with my just retired supervisor, Cameron Barrows, and the park staff. They've established weather stations at all these sites. So he was able to use those to look at essentially what is the boundary between those hot lower desert climates and the upper desert climate up here. So we have, this is on this map, this is Joshua Tree. You can see a line drawn here in white. That's sort of the NPS map transition zone line that you'll see on all those park signs along Park Boulevard. That's the sort of accepted transition zone based on a combination of factors. And he wanted to do that same thing, but using climate data. And so he did like I said, a regionalization, looked at the climate data. And so he was working on what is that boundary, in fact, and I welcome you to read his paper for the details. But for us today, I just want to express that there really is a transition zone between the lower, hotter desert and the upper, cooler Mojave Desert. And that is an area that we might see, shift with climate change. So keep that in mind. What was really cool is, like I said, the paper just came out. And I was looking at some of these weather stations I've been to, and this really illustrates the differences between the lower desert and the upper desert. So we have precipitation in the bars show precipitation here. The lines show temperature over the year. That's January through December. And we have one station being Lost Horse Valley. And on the last slide, that was here, number 15. And the other one is North Coxcombs, which is here. And that is those are the red bars. So you can see a real difference. Again, the lower desert being hotter, but also having this signature of a little bit more summer rain. So that's an interesting difference between the deserts as well. We don't get a ton of summer rain in the southern Mojave Desert, but we do get some. And here's another look at monthly precipitation over the year. So at Black Rock, which is northwestern part of the park, Palm Springs and North Coxcombs, again, northeast part of the park, you can see that signature of summer monsoonal rain pickup in the eastern part of the park over July and August, which is really interesting. So with that in mind, let's look at the vegetation of Joshua Tree National Park. It's CNPS, so I have to have a bunch of, nice plant photos in here. All these photos are mine. I think if it's not, there's a credit at the bottom, FYI. These are some of the areas I get to work in, and it's a wonderful place to work, I will say, and I get to work with wonderful people. So vegetation starting up in the Mojave Desert. Of course, that's, like I said, upper elevation, also further north than the Colorado Desert. We have beautiful cacti. That's a picture I took at Black Rock of hedgehog cactus blooming there. Another place we get to work is near Queen Mountain. We have a plot there that we've gotten data from. This is the crew measuring a pinyon pine up near Queen Mountain. You notice the pinyon, more dense vegetation, really getting into maybe even Great Basin looking vegetation, but this is an area of Joshua Tree upper elevation. And then we have the Sonoran Colorado desert vegetation many of you are familiar with. This is just on the Bajada on the south side of Joshua Tree, just west of Park Boulevard. We get beautiful wildflower displays down there. This picture is from a few years ago. Chia and Celia, Ocotillo, plenty of flowers to see there. I have not been out yet. I think it's a little bit early, by the way. But this is another photo from a couple years back, Sonoran Desert. And of course, we have the beautiful ghost flowers, which I think were just renamed. So I think it's Mojave, but it might be something else now. But just those wonderful desert annuals that we all enjoy that come up, once a year or once every couple years, and we enjoy those blooms, and then they go back to seed. So I wanted to talk about a little bit about the formation of Joshua Tree National Park. I put these slides together for another group, and I couldn't take them out of this presentation. So it's just really interesting. So, as you know, Minerva Hamilton Hoyt was a Pasadena socialite that was active in 1920s conservation in the region. And she was critical in advocating for Desert Plants National Monument. What's interesting is for the Garden Club of America's flower show, she actually filled 7 freight cars with desert rocks, plants, and ship them to New York. Luckily, we don't do that anymore. We don't need to. We can hopefully take, YouTube and Instagram, to spread the word about our desert plants without uprooting them and transporting them. But it had an impact because they didn't have that media. And so, by the way, all this information is from Desbra Netburn's wonderful column about Minerva Hoyt. So she also sent a book to the president to encourage him to establish Joshua Tree National Park. There was a monument, of course, before the park. Many people still call it the monument. And it was established as a national park in 1994. And here's a look at that era. Okay, now back to climate change. So we're going to think about assessing climate change vulnerability for species. This is something as a conservation biologist that I'm interested in, and that partner agencies, National Park Service, and land management agencies want to know about what's going to happen to these natural resources in the future. So what can we do? We can try to detect any range contraction by measuring mortality and condition across that transition zone. Could we detect range shift by measuring plant size class across that transition zone? And then we have a sort of a framework for assessing climate change vulnerability. This is a little bit of an older paper, Science 2011 from Dawson, but it gives us just the level we need here, I think, which is we think about species being sensitive to climate change. We think about, exposure to climate change, low versus high. Some areas are actually maybe refugia, or they have less change in temperature into the future. So some species that live there might be lower exposure to climate change. Others might be very exposed to climate change, being very exposed to climate factors. And then the species themselves, Can they adapt quickly? Is the generation time fast? All that. And are they sensitive to these higher temperatures and changes? So these are different things we can think about in that framework. And so in 2014, as I said, my just retired PI, Cameron Barrows, he and Michelle Murphy-Mariscal and others did a vulnerability assessment on species within Joshua Tree. So this involved a literature search and rating all of these species based on factors that might indicate sensitivity. So again, like what's the generation turnover time? What's do they need a specific pollinator to make fruit, et cetera? So what are the vulnerabilities from life history, characteristics, and biology, and what might be the reduction or change in predicted range of the species? So this is a list that's published. Again, I invite you to check that out, Biological Conservation 2014. And some of the species I'll talk about today, one being pinyon. So one of the most vulnerable species came out as pinyon pine, Joshua tree up there, of course, other species like chuckwalla, sensitive as well. And then we get down to maybe some of the least sensitive, at least by this framework, species being like creosote or Encelia. And those might be species that are just very, very tough to kill via drought. They just sort of persist. They're very tolerant to hot temperatures and drought. And they disperse well. And they're sort of, some of them are like weedy species. And so this vulnerability assessment, I came onto this group in 2015. And so I've been thinking about this vulnerability assessment. And so, I thought, can we, now that we have, so they did the study in 2014. And then since then, we have data on 27 macro plots within Joshua Tree National Park and one outside on MDLT land. And so we have these plots where we've measured the abundance of lots of species. We have cover of lots of species measured at all these plots. And so how did this framework bear out? So those things that were predicted to be sensitive, were they sensitive in the end? Were they not sensitive in the end? And so here's a look at the list here, more vulnerable species. Here are the plants. I'm just going to focus on plants here. Pinyon pine, manzanita, blackbrush, juniper, oak, jojoba, and Joshua trees. And less vulnerable, ocotillo, at least, just sort of dividing the list in half. Ocotillo, ironwood, Mojave yucca, Acton's Encelia, brittlebush, and our good old creosote bush. So is there a difference between these two lists? So I don't know that we're going to have the answer, by the way, spoiler alert, but we're still working on it. But overall, that launched this climate change collaborative project that we've had ongoing with the park for years. And again, it's to measure species response to climate change across all of these gradients: winter rain increasing to the west, summer rain increasing to the east and probably north, and then temperature increasing to the east. So what did we do? Again, we had 27 macro plots. We have line intercept data for those. We have a belt transect, that's abundance of species. And then later on, we actually implemented what we call the full demographic sweep, which is just to count everything in the plot for each species, count every individual in the plot. So we have GPS coordinates, height, and width for certain species for all those. So I started to look at these data and like I said, it really ongoing. But if we're thinking about which species might be vulnerable to climate change, the answer is we don't have enough data, we need more. But if we look at the data we do have from these macro plots, remember these species only occur in some of those macro plots. So we could always use more data. But let's look at total cover on the line of a species. A given species that we're measuring across the park. And let's look at water deficit. So CWD is climatic water deficit. This is a proxy for aridity. So at each plot, how arid was it, and what was the cover of pinyon at the plot? The dead cover, the live cover. And so if we look at that, as it gets drier for pinyon, preliminarily, this is unpublished data, as we go an increase in climatic water deficit or drought, we essentially get higher cover of dead pinyon on those plots. And so this might be an indication of higher mortality in drier areas already occurring. So that's one way we could detect climate change. Over here is my favorite pinyon pine in the park, by the way. I won't tell you where it is, but it's beautiful, and it's at Black Rock Canyon. It's up on a hillside. So, and then we look at, how about we look at the abundance of species? Like I said, we have this belt data. So that's a count of species within a belt. And so for Coleogene ramosissima or black brush, let's look at the count. And just for fun, let's look at average maximum temperature in July over the gradient. So for black brush, which is rated to be pretty vulnerable to climate change, how many of the species are we seeing that are mature and young? And what is the sort of average temperature over which they occur? And so we could run an average there and see that in general, younger individuals are found at cooler plots, and older individuals are found in hotter plots by abundance. So you can see young individuals generally increasing as you get towards higher temps. So again, we need more data. We don't have enough data to really make conclusions here. But we could, using this methodology, we could see an indication of shift in younger plants towards cooler areas potentially. Again, unpublished, we're still working on this. And there's a picture of blackbrush at Black Rock Canyon. Over here, you can see that it gets fairly abundant, and especially in the upper Mojave. And let's look at, potentially inconclusive results. This is, again, all of this is inconclusive because it's not published yet. But let's say for juniper. So we might look at the same data. We can look at the count of juniper over the gradient from cooler to warmer. And potentially we're not seeing a difference in where mature individuals are as opposed to the youngest new seedlings. So that's an example of something that we might expect not to see such a shift with climate change in the species potentially. And if you look overall, the vulnerability assessment score here, the species to the left, are we seeing indications of a range contraction by, the drier edge? We're seeing mortality. Are we seeing recruitment shift or more younger individuals towards the leading edge where it's cooler or there's more moisture? And so if we look at that, it's sort of a wash. Now, again, this is a snapshot. We measured these plots over a 3-year period. And as we know, the climate in the desert is up and down year to year. So we really need a very long-term monitoring to detect the type of shifts we need to know about. So again, the responses varied by effect size, how much difference there was, and how much we could detect that. And there's differences in life history, natural density, and the portion of the range that we studied, because we're only studying Joshua Tree National Park. So we may be truncating the range and not looking at the full range of some species. So we need a longer term monitoring framework, but this provides a good baseline. But we might need more intensive sampling to really say something about what might happen. All right, and I'm just going to give a quick, some of you have seen my Joshua Tree talk before, but I'm just going to sort of summarize the results we found or we published in 2019 about Joshua trees. And so we, using similar methodology, looked at the abundance over the park. So why Joshua trees? People love them. They're unique. They're important in the ecosystem. They're also vulnerable. Growth is slow and conservative. The reproduction is episodic and maybe rare. It really, they can reproduce via stump sprouts or via seed, but that relies on a whole chain of factors that have to occur for it to reproduce. Has one specific symbiotic pollinator, and it really has a lack of broad scale seed dispersal. So they don't disperse very fast, and the habitat is vastly flat, which is also a challenge for climate change. Here are some photos of the sole pollinator. This is what the flowers look like, the seeds, and then here is a plant, a young seedling coming up underneath a nurse shrub. So what we wanted to find out was, where are the healthiest Joshua tree stands now, and where will they be in the future? Because in order to have old Joshua trees, you need young Joshua trees first. So there are some, of course, Joshua tree models that were already made. They were at more coarse scale, and we wanted to refine them and also test them. Again, here's a beautiful illustration by Juniper Harrower, looking at the clonal reproduction path and the sexual reproduction path for the species. But again, we need new trees in order to have old trees. So how are the populations weathering these climate changes? And how should the park best manage Joshua tree habitat? And where should it be prioritized? So if they do see shifts, should they implement specific management actions where Joshua trees, if they start dying in an area, should they manage there, or should they manage the healthy stands now while they're still there? There are 2 species of Joshua trees. This is still being worked out, but I had some poorly drawn delineations that I did by hand that I was informed by Chris Smith the other day that I had a couple lines that were wrong here. But essentially, let's just say the left side of the map, that's the Western Joshua tree. The right side of the map here, there's the Eastern Joshua tree, with some ins and outs here. At Mojave National Preserve, importantly, that's the Eastern Joshua tree, even though it's really close to here. That's the Eastern species. Where we are, where I am nearby, is Joshua Tree National Park, is the southern extent of the range. So this is our driest range edge. This is hottest, driest populations of this Western Joshua tree. And Lynn's had a really nice paper in 2007 looking at the differences between these 2 species. So if you want a really handy guide or key to know which species you're looking at, that's really helpful. The brevifolia versus the Jaegeriana to the east. Okay, but focusing again on how we do our research, we look at species distribution models. So we had a range map of the species, right? So this is a range map. This is somebody drawing a line around populations of the species. Now they might draw connect all the dots and sort of fill in the gaps. They might, draw buffers around individual trees. There are various ways to draw maps of trees, and they can show very different things based on how you draw those maps, because species could be abundant, or a dot could represent one tree in a very sparse area. So map drawing is a challenge, I think, for conservation management decisions. So, but when we look at species distribution models, this is a model of what's the habitat for that species? What are the factors that the species needs to survive and reproduce? So this would be temperature, precipitation, soil, slope, aspect, where's the pollinator thrive? And so that's what we try to get at, but it's a model. All models are a little bit wrong. So we take these environmental data layers, and we take GPS data for Joshua trees, and we make projected habitat models. So we can do that with current climate grids, and we can do that for future climate grids. So we're all relying on the reliability of that underlying climate data in the model. And when we look at where species can persist in the landscape, we look at we can look at refugia. So, okay, so this is a photo I took at Black Rock. Okay, so imagine I'm on the top of high view here. Some of you may have been there. So we have low elevation to the right and high elevation to the left, and we have maybe a little snow actually right there. So let's imagine a fictitious species. Let's say it occurs, excuse me, where the red blob is. Okay, that's where it occurs now. And let's say I run my model, and my model says, okay, if you take the future temperature in this spot, you plop that down, this is where the species could occur. And so that yellow blob might be really good for coyotes, pinyon jays, something that can move really easily, Encelia farinosa. But for Joshua trees and other very slow moving species, long-lived species, the area where they're really going to occur in the future is this area where the overlap is. We're calling this the refugia. So this is an area where the species occurs now and where it can support the species into the future without having to make it jump into this new habitat. So that's what we're really looking at. And so we also have an uncertainty of future climate change. So this is a graphic that was put together by Francesca Hopkins and team using the California CalAdapt data for the state. And so this is looking at average maximum temperature on the x-axis, and y-axis is time. So we have historic observed temperature, that black line there, and then we have several different futures based on these RCPs or scenarios. So the most serious of which is in the red. So we have one scenario in which we have a highly mitigated scenario. We do something about climate change as a globe, and we reduce those emissions. That's the highly mitigated scenario, 4.5, and that's probably the most realistic at this point, although there do exist other scenarios. Then we have moderately mitigated, and then we have business as usual, RCP 8.5. So that means we just do nothing and continue emitting as we are now. So what we wanted to look at is, well, we know that there's uncertainty all around, right, about the current predicted habitat and habitat into the future. But why don't we look at what's the difference between if we do something about climate change within the highly mitigated, or we just continue emitting carbon as we are business as usual. And so first we put together a preliminary, or excuse me, a current habitat model for the species. And that's shown here in gray. So this is the Joshua Tree National Park. This is a modeling boundary here. And the area in gray is generally what might support Joshua trees into the future using a variety of factors. Let's look at the highly mitigated scenario. So potentially unhappy Joshua trees, but maybe we keep 20% of the historic range in terms of what is the suitable habitat for Joshua trees. Next, we might look at moderately mitigated scenario, less historic range preserved, and then under a business as usual, we really have not a lot of the historic range preserved, at least within Joshua Tree National Park, using the climate data from the climatologists. Now, we don't know what that looks like on the ground. So if we're talking about 50 years from now, so when my son who's 4, he'll be, 54 or so. This is within his lifetime. And so thinking about what that might look like for a Joshua tree, that's almost no time at all. They might stay, we might have adult trees remain, but this could also mean decreases in recruitment of species. This could be decrease in abundance. This could also mean that after fires happen, there's no new recruitment. So we really have to see what that means for trees, but this certainly is not a good prediction. However, again, all models are a little bit wrong, and we want to see, as we saw in that other graph from Francesca Hopkins and team, there already have been some changes in temperature and precipitation, even in the past, 30, 50 years. And so has that had an impact already? Can we start to detect some of those changes? So what we did is we had teams of community scientists go out, various universities, spring breaks groups, elementary schools come out and count every tree in each plot and map them. And so let's see. Okay, so when we're looking at each plot, let's say we're looking at how many seedlings there are, how many adults there are. And what we did is we said which plots, which areas of the landscape are recruiting less, as in there are less seedlings there, and which have more. It's just a very simple look, because again, you need young trees to have old trees. Regardless of the density of old trees, you need young trees. And so we looked at where are they most abundant. And that would be Highview Trail, Black Rock, Upper Covington, places like Eureka Peak, potentially too cold, not ripe yet. But overall, what we saw is those areas that are recruiting well are closer to those predicted refugia. So it's the same directionality as we are predicting for the future, bearing out some truth to the model. So this again took a lot of hours for a lot of volunteers. Here's a look at the full demographic data for this. This is looking at size class here shown in black and white but you can see the youngest trees on the left of each bar graph and the oldest trees on the right of these bar graph. Again, this is we did not publish this data set, so this is unpublished, and please don't cite it. We also have dead trees. This is all dead trees, and I'm not differentiating how long ago they died, but this is the abundance of dead trees. Now, to get a stable population, you really need lots of young ones, slightly less, older ones, and probably you'll have a decline to the oldest ones. Now you can see a lot of these populations don't look like that. Some do and some don't. And if you look at even the mortality bar, we only measured mortality on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 plots. Okay, so the other ones do not have mortality bars because we did not measure that. But you look at the mortality, you can see it's quite high for some of these plots, and even exceeds, the numbers that we have, especially for juveniles. And I apologize for some of the names of the plots there. Those are old names and they've been changed. Okay, so priority. So if we look at how do we want to keep Joshua trees in place into the future? So the priority areas is to protect areas susceptible to fires. Again, if we're going to see a shift in habitat, we might, keep trees for a long time, but if we have fires, they might not come back. This is a photo of eastern Joshua trees at Sema Dome. And this is a picture of actually like the body of the Joshua tree and the ashes from that Joshua tree. And so this is what we don't want to see because they're not well adapted to fire. So only about 10% of Joshua trees survive wildfire. We need more study there, especially for the western and eastern trees. The modeled areas of refugia might be used to plan fire management. So that's already happening in the park. They're using, how can they use this information about where Joshua trees might be sustainable into the future to prioritize protecting those areas? Because if we see die off in lower elevation areas, there could be very little we can do about that, but can instead we protect those refugia into the future. So that's being used, and we published a paper about that. Seed banks, especially valuable for habitat restoration as well. So that is one way we can ensure at least protecting our ability to sow seed into the future. As many of you know, at Sema Dome, there's a restoration effort to restore Joshua trees into the areas that burned. And that's thanks to them they happen to have a source for seed and the ability to outplant. And that doesn't just magically happen. That's somebody's effort. So that needs to be funded and thought about. And so in general, when we just think about biogeography and how will Joshua trees survive? So we'll try to take a positive spin on this. So this is roughly, the range thrown over the landscape here. And this is roughly our refugia map for the highly optimistic scenario in green here. So when we think about how Joshua trees might survive, luckily, potentially using some topography, they might remain in cooler, wetter areas, as many species might. We might call those refugia. Those might help conserve not only Joshua trees, but the community, blackbrush and other species that might need those areas. So topography, microrefugia, because it's very hard for species to shift really quickly with their sort of habitat niche, which might be shifting again up in elevation and really far north. Thing is, to get to the same temperature band, you could go just up, now the plant, right, could shift just uphill, in some areas and get to that same temperature because due to lapse rates, but you actually have to shift much farther to the north to trace that same temperature band. And that kind of thing, it gets very difficult for long-lived species. So again, shift uphill, it's much easier for the plant than shifting really far to the north. So we might see shifts uphill where they can. Now these populations in the flats, they have a long ways to go to try to match that temperature band. So let's say there's a Joshua tree, in the middle of this map, it might have 20 kilometers to go to match that temperature band in 50 years. Can they do that? So that velocity of climate change is much higher there. So, okay, back to the positive note. So what can we do? Wildfire prevention, again, do your best to prevent wildfire, action on climate change and reductions in air quality, which, as we all know, air quality has to do with air pollution coming from all sources, much of which is automobiles. We have nitrogen in the air. Nitrogen gets deposited on the landscape. That fuels invasive grasses, which are non-native. They're unusually abundant, and then we can have fires. So we wouldn't naturally have so much biomass to be burning and connecting trees before now, but now we have that. We have that layer of herbs. So somebody tosses out a sprinkler firework, 4th of July, that could spell disaster for a lot of species. Okay, and I'm going to talk about our newest efforts, one of mine being on the right. He's a little taller now, but there he is checking out, demography in Joshua Tree National Park with me on Ariagonum. And so when we think about climate change, again, we want to be looking for an effort that can be, comprehensive. It can be sort of a rapid assessment in many different places of what's occurring on the ground. These are the sort of data we need to make effective conservation decisions about species. Is we need really systematic data throughout species ranges. So on the left is an ocotillo, a baby ocotillo. So, all right. So we launched in many, many hours. I have to thank Neil Frakes and Nicholas Graver at the park for many, many, many hours of conversation about this project. So we designed the Minerva Project, named after, of course, Minerva Hoyt. And I'm probably going to get it wrong. Monitoring invasives in native vegetation and annuals, something like that. Don't have it spelled out. But essentially, so it's a comprehensive network to be one strategy to monitor species across the park. And this, so we designed it, we used a randomized design, a randomized tessellation strategy to essentially throw a huge amount of plots across the park that we can rapidly assess, get an idea of the abundance of many species and figure out what's going on with them. So here is a look again at the park. On the left, stratified by Vegetation Alliance and fire history. And there's a look at somebody measuring plots and Nick out on the plots measuring with volunteers. So in designing the project, we wanted to look at species that might be very vulnerable to climate change and might be less vulnerable to climate change. And we used a framework it's based on Thomas et al. From USGS. And they looked at plant distributions and future climate change ranges of species, including Joshua trees. So their framework essentially says, for species, there are species that might have a high retained suitable habitat into the future, and the high potential to have new habitat into the future. And then by contrast, you could have a low refugia score. So you're going to lose all your habitat and low potential to disperse anywhere. And so these are probably the most vulnerable on the bottom right-hand side. And what we did is we used species distribution models. I actually used a climate change data set, climatology data set from Patrick Gonzalez, a different data set than we used for the 2019 paper, to model potential habitat of many species across 4 counties. And despite, we have a small amount of funding for that project. We're working to get more, but we managed to run models for a lot of different species to at least allow us to populate this grid with a variety of perennial species. Here's what we had to deal with. So when we first put together this project in discussions with Nick, there are 388 perennial species in Joshua trees. So we knew we could not manage to model or measure all this. So we had to pare it down. So we pared it down. This is a draft look at our decision tree, but essentially pare it down from 400 species to 120 species. And then really we had to pare it down to just the species that we could possibly handle. So, I think we ended up with about 40 species or so. We needed really sufficient data to do all of this. So after many, many talks, I've just thrown in a couple things here. So first, a look at our habitat models on the left. So this is a species. This is the outline of Joshua Tree National Park here. And so habitat loss for this species, whatever it is in orange here. habitat refugia is in green, and then potential habitat is in blue here. So this, whatever this species is, it ended up about in the mediums, so this is about medium potential, medium refugia. Very vulnerable species being, and actually this, I apologize, this grid is flipped from what you last were looking at. So low refugia, low potential is actually up in the top left corner here. So that ended up being species like Joshua trees and pinyon pines. So you might look at a pretend species in the upper right here and modeled across the 4-county area, at least looking at refugia or lost habitat in orange and refugia in green across the range for that species. And then we have some species we might that might not be as vulnerable on the bottom right. So that's things like Parkinsonia, Fucaria, and Celia. And those species may be persistent. So we used our own new sort of vulnerability assessment, really just focusing on what we call sensitivity and exposure, not focusing on adaptive capacity, which is a whole nother topic. And that's a topic genetic researchers can look at, and that Joshua Tree Genome Project is getting at, is where are the areas with the best potential for the species to persist as well. So that's another piece of the puzzle. So just focusing on sensitivity and exposure here to climate change, we put the project underway. So we have these huge graded plots. This is, by the way, this photo is just pre-COVID. We were able to practice one plot before COVID hit, but this is students on spring break. They were helping us measure perennial vegetation cover and abundance within these plots. And so after many sort of practice rounds, we figured out the methodology for this, including measuring and counting dead plants and seedlings, again, across the park. So across that whole transition zone. So we anticipate having really good data from this project, and we're really excited about it. And it's really, I have to thank the park for leading that and prioritizing that effort, because it should give them the sort of information they need for management of these species and that important, resource that we all love and share. So thinking about this all, so what can you do? One is to depoliticize findings on climate change that are science-based. So this isn't, I'm not a politician. This isn't politics. I'm a biologist, and I look at what's happening to species. So depoliticizing that, engaging your community. I'm sure that many of you care about these species and speak up in all sorts of venues in order to help protect species. And I thank you for that. And my job as a scientist is to give you the information you need to engage. Support responsible renewable energy. So if you think about facing climate change, there might be some tough decisions to be made about how we create this energy that we apparently need as a species. And so how do we do that? Do we do that via wind energy? There are a lot of options. And so especially with solar, thinking about solar in the desert, could trying to save species from climate change lead to their demise? So that's something that we really need to be thinking about as well. Support seed banking. A lot of the gardens where I have friends and colleagues are doing important work on species seed banking efforts, and as well as nonprofits like Mojave Desert Land Trust doing, again, great work, because we need those. That doesn't magically happen after events like fires. We need that. And in understanding issues of environmental justice. So understanding that that climate change is not going to have the same impact across communities. It's going to have differential impacts on some communities. Let's say energy bills, as your energy bill goes up for that air conditioning. Can you afford that? Can somebody else afford that? Sea level rise. There are all sorts of issues that will affect some communities more than others. Support equity, diversity, and inclusion in science. We need all the voices at the table, and we need everyone to be listening and working together on this, and supporting access to parks and open spaces as well. So in conclusion, so forecasting, climate related shifts in species occurrence is important for conservation. This is increasingly what might be used for, decisions on what we do about species management. We need to test those predictions with field data. That's important because, again, to understand when that climate window shifts, what that looks like in terms of what that'll mean for the species. We need to be looking at what happens even now. And for some species, retaining suitable habitat under business is there as usual. I apologize, there's a word missing there, but what I meant to say was it might be really challenging to retain habitat for some of these species under a business as usual scenario, and not even the iconic Joshua tree, but some other species, even species it might depend on as nurse plants, might be challenged with climate change. And overall, what really motivates people to take any action on climate change is going to be what's affecting their personal lives. There's some folks that are able to act in the to the greater good, but for many people, it's about day to day. How does it affect their life, their recreation, and how they're spending their weekends? So it's important to recognize and talk about those things that are happening already that are affecting our lives. And I want to thank, as well as, again, the land that we're working on was tended by ancestral peoples for a long time. So we need to recognize that and, again, try to integrate that into the science we're doing as well. What impact did that have on the abundance of any of these species in the past? So that's something we need to increasingly look at as scientists as well, and community members. Also, I want to thank the fantastic folks of the National Park Service for initiation of this project. My just retired mentor, Dr. Cameron Barrows, who was critical in the inception of this project. I wouldn't be doing this if he hadn't hired me to first count lizards. So that was a fantastic turn of events for me as I take the lead role at this CCB lab now. And I want to thank all the other partners, and for the Minerva monitoring, I especially want to thank Nick Graver, and then Scott and Melanie Davis, who also work with us here at CCB, for all their hard work on the Minerva project. So we hope to have lots of data to share very soon. And that's all I have, and I'll take questions.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. That was really wonderful. Just helps to very well understand not only how you've put together the projections about Joshua trees, and great to have some really good suggestions on how we can positively affect that in the future. So thanks for that. Apologize also for my barking dog. So we're ready for questions. If you have questions, if you could just post those in the Q&A. And I'm going to start with the first question, and then folks can think about whatever other questions they may want to ask. Christina Sanchez asks, is there similar research being done on Yucca yageriana?
So some other groups looking at that species. So Leslie DeFalco and SQ at the USGS out of Nevada have been, doing research on Joshua trees for a long time. And I will say, before we were really looking at them as two species, there was a lot of research happening. And so we need to really figure out what we know for each species separately. And so, but certainly they've been doing research on Joshua trees for quite some time to the east, as well as, I'm going to forget all the names in the moment, but there's a group out of University in Utah as well, looking at a post-fire recovery of the eastern tree. So there are definitely some folks looking at some of these issues for the eastern tree. We don't have a full model for the species, if that's what you're thinking about. We don't have full models for each species independently for all the range, except if you could look at that Thomas et al., I think it's 2012 paper that does have a model of Joshua trees. But other than that, we really just have like Cole's model that actually combined the species and had some really questionable, point data in it as well. So we could use more funding and more modeling efforts across species. I hope that answers your question.
Sorry. Another question and comment from Bob Allen. Hi, Lynn. Very nice. Hi. May I have a copy of your procedure for the plots?
Yes. Let me either write that down or Bob.
Yeah.
On Twitter, I think
Yeah, I
think we were
can
talking on Twitter
facilitate.
the other day.
We can help you get in touch with Bob if you
Yeah,
want.
yeah,
We'll just arrange Bob to
yep.
get Lynn your email or whatever so she can get that for you.
Yes, we are really just refining it, and our intent is to make a natural resources technical report from NPS so that it'll be spelled out how we conceived of the Minerva project and what the protocols are and implementation. That might take some time, but I think we're pretty much settled on our protocol now. And yeah, I'm sure we can share.
Okay. A question from Arlie Montalvo. Amazing presentation. How many field hours does it take to monitor the plots in the current research? It looks like a massive project. It
is massive. Gosh, it's been such a whirlwind. Again, with COVID, right after we were, implementing it or trying to, it depends on the plot. The idea is for a team of, I'm going to get this wrong, and I don't know if Nick's watching, but a team of 4 or so to be able to do one in a day. And you could probably do 2 if they were nearby. The thing is, with that random stratifying, we've put plots all over the place. Nick is going all over the place. It's really awesome. I mean, I think he's seeing parts of the park that he would never see otherwise. But the idea is, one plot per day for a small team, but lots of hours. Yeah. Originally, this was, again, we were focused on those macro plots. Those were a ton of work as well. So this is meant to be more rapid. And we have a set number of plots we do each year, and it's a rotating basis. So we do not do all 100 or so plots each year. I think it's a reasonable amount of 40 or so. But we're still relying on, VIPs, volunteers in parks, and other groups to help.
Okay. A question from George Chang. Does Joshua Tree need nurse plans? And if so, what are they?
Yes. So Joshua Tree, it's not inconceivable that they could establish without a nurse plan. But when we actually look at young individuals, we almost all the time see that they've emerged from a nurse plant. And so that would be primarily like black brush, but it also might be, and I was literally just writing this list the other day, so I'm forgetting a few, but we've seen them under nurse sort of objects like rocks, so rock crevices, cacti, really anything that can protect. The key is to protect them from herbivores. And that is the research that Leslie and Todd are doing out in the Mojave, is to really look at how do you protect these things from jackrabbits, because that's really a bottleneck in terms of the seedling establishment. So something that can protect them, provide moisture and cover from herbivores. Yeah, and so that's a problem. After fire, you lose those nurse shrubs.
Okay. Let's see, there is a question about, is the presentation recorded and need to watch it again? So yes, the presentation is recorded and it will be posted on our website. So that might be, maybe not immediately, but we'll have that posted, and you can have access to it that way. And you can always email us at rsb@cnps.org. So there's another, let's see, go ahead and put questions in if you have more questions. There's a comment, thank you for the presentation, from Casey. And then another question from George, is the climate shift mainly happening inland or on the coast as well?
I'm not as familiar with the projections for the coast, but the state of California put together individual climate change reports for all the regions, including the Inland Empire. So the map I showed was the inland area, and perhaps the Riverside folks might know better what climate change report from the state covers Western Riverside and the coast. My guess is that everything's just going up all over. And I'm sorry to say that. I do not say that with any joy at all. But warmer and drier is generally what we're seeing. Katie, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, just that I don't have specific knowledge either of the coast, but I think the same general pattern is being seen everywhere, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Okay, how's a question? How old are the bigger Joshua trees?
So they are arborescent monocots, so they do not lay tree rings. as would oaks and other plants. So these trees, they're a tree because my 4-year-old says they're a tree, so they're a tree. But so we don't know. We need better studies. We have like formulas that we could use. That's all based on precipitation. Okay, that's a very boring answer. So probably a couple 100 years old is all I can say. The thing is, they can also clone themselves, remember, so they can send up, new shoots. So in that way, they could be much older, but yeah.
Okay.
Few hundred.
There's a question from Shannon. How do you volunteer to help?
The best idea is to get in touch with the park, Joshua Tree National Park. I'm not sure if how their information is online. You could, email me and I will get you in touch with them. But it's essentially run by their Volunteer in Parks program with Nicholas Graver and Jay Goodwin, the new Veg Branch chief. So you can check in with them.
Okay, let's see. There's another question from Bob Allen. Is anyone monitoring the Joshua trees near Tohon Pass and the Grapevine?
Mm-hmm. I do not know. Not that I know of. However, I think there are efforts underway to map the range of the Joshua tree more precisely. And so we might hear more about that, hopefully soon. So, and that would hopefully have some idea of like abundance of Joshua trees at each spot. But I'm not super familiar. Yeah, I know that's a really interesting population.
Here's another question from George. When there's no pollinator for Joshua trees left, do we lose Joshua trees essentially?
Yes. I mean, they can persist with resprouting. And we're actually about to look at a big data set that the park collected independent of these efforts I talked about of, where is the most asexual reproduction? Where are they sprouting the most? And all sorts of other fun questions. I'll tackle that over the summer when it's quiet. But but as far as we know, they need seed and they need to be pollinated. And there's one pollinator that does that in a very interesting way. And you could read about that.
Okay, here's another question from Bob. I need to come out and photograph the Joshua tree pollinating moth. When is a good time to do so?
Ooh, okay. So both on the last question and on this question, I will refer you to Juniper Harrower at UC Santa Cruz and Dr. Chris Smith, who's currently, I think, on sabbatical, both of whom look at pollination. And I will say Juniper looked at how much pollination is happening across elevation. So that's the answer to that last question is we need somebody studying pollination across the gradient. And then second, Chris Smith is the one that really knows I think his handle is Dr. Moth on Twitter. So I do not know the answer to that question. But I think Chris would. When they're blooming. This is my thought. We could follow up later though, and maybe I could get an answer for you.
Okay, let's see. Not a question, but a comment from Arlie Montalvo. I have a 2018 paper with Aaron Riordan and Jan Byers that looks at climate models and projected shifts in suitable habitat for about 40 shrub taxa for our region. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's something we could make available by posting it on our website. Mm-hmm. Okay, actually, if there are any other questions, I don't have any others right at this moment. It looks like that's it for the questions. So perfect timing, Lynn. Thanks very much for a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate. Whoops, wait a minute. Sorry, I think I might have another question.
Thank
just
you,
popped up.
CNPS
Sorry.
audience. It was honored to be asked. Hopefully we get back to in person.
We really appreciate your being available on Saturday to talk to us about Joshua trees and the important work that you are doing. And we will be posting the recording for this presentation, and also keep your eyes out. We are working on our March presentation. Do you mind taking one more question?
Yeah.
Is the natural habitat shrinking historically?
So I normally have a slide in here showing the past distribution of the Joshua Tree, at least as estimated using middens, pack rat middens that was in the paper by Cole et al. And it probably had a much broader distribution in the Southwest that contracted. Now that paper probably extrapolates even too much between all the points. We don't know that it was that huge to begin with. It probably was smaller, especially if you read the follow-up by Chris Smith. Anyway, and so it had a larger habitat to the southeast, contracted after all the glaciations, but probably might have increased a little bit to the north as well while it was contracting. So we don't know that it necessarily lost the habitat. You should read Chris's paper. I don't have a citation, but Chris Smith. So yes, naturally contracting a little bit, but certainly nothing. This is unprecedented shift in temperature and precip. If that answers.
Yeah. Yep. We can all do as much as we can do personally to try to make a difference.
Yes.
Okay, so that's it for this morning. Thanks everybody for joining us. We've got lots of comments. Lynn, thanking you for the presentation and all the good information.
Thank you all.
And have a good Saturday.
Hope you get outside.
Thanks. Yep, get
Thank
outside.
you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.